He never knew he had a daughter, until a little girl walked up to him in a restaurant and called him Daddy. Andrew Reeves had built his life around power, wealth, and precision. Every day was calculated, every hour accounted for, and every decision weighed against profit and loss. To the outside world he was untouchable, a man whose golden touch turned every venture into success. Yet beneath the expensive suits and polished reputation, he carried the unspoken truth that his life was empty when the workday ended. His penthouse was silent, his dinners alone, and even the admiration of colleagues or the envy of competitors did not fill the hollow ache he buried deep inside. Years ago, when Madison had walked out of his life, he had told himself it was necessary, that love was a distraction he could not afford, that family was a chain he did not want around his neck. He let her go without fighting for her, convincing himself that freedom and ambition mattered more. He had no idea she had left carrying something far more permanent than heartbreak. The restaurant that night was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of jazz music spilling from the live band in the corner. Andrew sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his partners on either side, the topic of conversation a merger worth hundreds of millions. He nodded, contributed smoothly, though part of his mind was elsewhere, clouded by the familiar weight of restlessness he never admitted. He reached for his wine when he felt a sudden presence beside him, small and delicate. He looked down and saw a little girl, no more than 5 years old, standing with her hands folded in front of her. Her blonde curls shimmered in the soft light, her cheeks rosy, and her eyes, those piercing, unmistakable blue eyes, stared up at him with a mixture of innocence and certainty. "Daddy," she said, her voice clear enough to cut through the noise of the restaurant. The entire table fell silent. His partners stopped mid-sentence, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. The waiter holding a tray paused, glancing nervously between Andrew and the child. For a man who always had an answer, Andrew found his mouth dry and his voice gone. He stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. There was no mistaking it, not with those eyes, the very same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. His heart stumbled in his chest, and for the first time in years, the world around him felt unsteady. Before he could speak, a familiar voice rang out, sharp and tense. "Sophie." A woman hurried toward them, her face pale with shock. "Madison." She looked almost the same and yet different, her long brown hair framed her face, her blue eyes filled with both fear and determination. She scooped the child into her arms, holding her tightly as if shielding her from him and from the entire room. "I told you not to wander off," she whispered to the girl, but her eyes never left Andrew's. He could not move. His mind spun with fragments of memory, the last fight they had, her walking out of his apartment with tears in her eyes, the pride that had kept him from chasing her. Now here she was, standing in front of him with a little girl who could only be his daughter. The weight of realization hit him with brutal force. For 5 years, he had lived in ignorance, burying himself in work while somewhere, without his knowledge, his own child had grown. The room began to stir again, the whisper of voices rising as the spectacle became gossip. Madison turned to leave, her arms wrapped protectively around Sophie, but Andrew finally found his voice. "Wait," he said, the word rough and desperate, more plea than command. She stopped but did not turn. "Is she?" He couldn't finish the sentence, his throat tightening. Madison's shoulders tensed, and after a long pause, she looked back at him. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and something he could not name. "This isn't the place," she said quietly. And then she walked away, leaving him frozen in his chair, his world tilting beneath him. For the rest of the evening, Andrew could barely hear the voices around him. His partners tried to resume conversation, but the merger, the money, the success, none of it mattered anymore. His glass of wine remained untouched. All he could see were the blue eyes of a little girl who had called him daddy. For the first time in his life, the man who thought he had everything realized he might have lost the only thing that truly mattered. Andrew barely slept that night. The image of the little girl burned into his mind, her blonde curls and piercing blue eyes haunting him like a ghost that would not leave. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing by his table, small and unafraid, calling him a name he had never earned but suddenly longed to hear again. He tried to distract himself by reading through the documents stacked neatly on his desk, tried to pour a glass of whiskey and drown the thoughts, but nothing worked. His mind kept circling back to Madison, to the way her eyes had looked at him across the restaurant, cold, protective, yet vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. He thought about how quickly she had left, clutching the child to her chest as if shielding her from him, and the ache in his chest grew heavier. The following morning, Andrew sat in his office, surrounded by the panoramic view of the city skyline that once gave him a sense of invincibility. Now the glass walls felt like a cage. His assistant came in with reports, his phone buzzed endlessly with calls from board members, and his email filled with urgent requests, but he could not focus on a single thing. For the first time in years, business felt trivial. He pulled open his drawer and retrieved a small, worn photograph he had hidden there years ago, one of the few reminders of Madison he had allowed himself to keep. It was taken on a summer afternoon, her hair windblown, her smile radiant, and he had forgotten how human she had once made him feel. Looking at it now filled him with regret so sharp it bordered on pain. By the afternoon, he could no longer stand the silence of his office or the meaningless chatter of his colleagues. He excused himself from meetings and retreated to his car, instructing his driver to take him through the city with no destination in mind. His thoughts were consumed with questions that refused to leave him. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she carried this burden alone for so long? Did she truly believe he would have turned his back if he had known about the child? A darker thought crept in, perhaps she had been right to doubt him. He had chosen his career over her once, shutting her out when she needed him most. Maybe Madison had looked at the man he was and decided he was not fit to be a father. The truth stung, but he could not deny its possibility. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the city, Andrew finally gathered the courage to call her. He had searched for her number, tracked it down through old contacts he barely remembered, and now he sat with his phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the screen. It rang twice before she answered, her voice cautious, distant, and edged with weariness. "Andrew," she said, not as a greeting but as a statement, as though she had been expecting this. He swallowed hard, struggling to find words, every phrase he had rehearsed vanishing under the weight of her tone. "I need to see you," he said finally, his voice low and uneven. "Please. Just a conversation. I deserve an explanation." "You deserve nothing," Madison replied coldly, though he could hear her breath hitch slightly on the other end. "You made your choice a long time ago." "I didn't know," he said, almost breaking, the frustration and desperation bleeding into his words. "I didn't know about her, Madison. If I had..." She cut him off sharply. "If you had? You would have left anyway. Don't lie to yourself. You cared more about your freedom, about your empire, than you ever cared about me. And I wasn't going to beg you to be a father. I wasn't going to raise our daughter on my knees." The silence that followed was suffocating. Andrew felt his chest tighten, his entire body heavy with guilt. Yet beneath it all was determination, a fire he had not felt in years. "Just one meeting," he pleaded quietly. "Not for me. For her. Let me see her. Let me try." There was a long pause, and for a moment he thought she would hang up. Finally, her voice came again, softer but still guarded. Tomorrow. The park on 5th Avenue. Morning. Don't be late. And if you scare her, if you hurt her in any way, this ends immediately. Andrew closed his eyes, relief flooding him, though it was laced with fear. Tomorrow he would face the truth not as Andrew Reeves, CEO of Reeves Global, but as a man stripped bare, about to meet the one person who could change everything. That night, as he lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, he understood something he had never admitted before: all the power in the world meant nothing if he could not earn the love of the little girl who had called him daddy in a crowded restaurant. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and damp, with thin mist curling around the buildings and dampening the streets. Andrew stood by the entrance of the park far earlier than he needed to, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. He wore a suit as he always did, though it felt like armor too heavy for the moment, and he had already undone his tie, as if shedding a small part of the CEO who had defined him for so long. His hands were restless, constantly brushing over his wristwatch or slipping into his pockets, his mind rehearsing possible words and discarding them just as quickly. How did one introduce himself to a daughter he had never known? How did a man who had lived so selfishly prove in one morning that he was capable of love and presence? The questions chased one another until his chest tightened with dread. He spotted them before they noticed him. Madison walked slowly along the gravel path, her hand gently holding the smaller one of Sophie, who skipped beside her with a child's careless energy. The sight froze him in place. Madison looked different in the daylight, no trace of the tense, hurried woman from the restaurant. Her hair was pulled back, her clothes simple yet elegant, and her expression was calm though her posture betrayed caution. Sophie wore a light blue dress and held a stuffed rabbit by the ear, dragging it along the ground with every step. She laughed at something her mother whispered, her curls bouncing, her joy radiating outward so brightly that Andrew felt both awe and regret twist inside him. When Madison's eyes found him, she stopped. Sophie tugged at her hand, curious, but Madison bent down to whisper something in her ear. The little girl nodded solemnly, though her eyes sparkled with the eagerness of a child who had no understanding of the weight carried by the adults around her. Together, they approached, and Andrew forced himself to breathe, his heart pounding so loud he wondered if they could hear it. "Madison," he said softly when they reached him, and his voice cracked in a way he hadn't expected. She gave him a measured nod. "Andrew." Her tone was even, but her gaze was sharp, evaluating, like a judge deciding whether the accused before her deserved mercy. Sophie tilted her head, studying him with curiosity. For a long moment she said nothing, and then, in that same clear voice he had heard in the restaurant, she asked, "Are you my daddy?" The word struck him harder than any blow ever could. He crouched down, lowering himself to her level, and though his throat was tight and his eyes burned, he managed to speak. "I'm Andrew," he said carefully, his voice trembling. "And yes, I think I am your daddy." Sophie blinked, her expression unreadable, and then she hugged her rabbit tighter. "You don't look like the daddies in my storybooks." The honesty of children, sharp and pure, nearly brought a laugh from him, though it was tinged with sorrow. "I know," he admitted gently. "But I want to try to be a good one, if you'll let me." Madison's breath caught, but she remained silent, watching closely. Sophie studied him a little longer, and then, with the logic of a 5-year-old, asked, "Do you like pancakes?" It was such a small question, so ordinary, yet it felt monumental. "I love pancakes," Andrew answered without hesitation, and for the first time, Sophie smiled at him, shy but genuine. They spent the morning walking through the park together, though it was awkward at times. Andrew tried not to overwhelm her, letting Sophie lead the conversation. She talked about her favorite cartoons, about her rabbit named Daisy, and about the swings she loved but was still too small to use alone. He listened with rapt attention, answering her endless questions with patience he had never known he possessed. Madison stayed nearby, quiet, her guard still up, but every so often he caught her watching him, her eyes softening for just a heartbeat before she looked away. When Sophie ran ahead to climb onto a bench and pretend it was her castle, Madison finally spoke. "Don't think one morning changes everything," she said in a low voice meant only for him. "You weren't there for the nights she cried. You weren't there for her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. You missed it all, Andrew. And nothing you do now can give her back those years." The words cut him deeply, but he didn't argue, because she was right. "I know," he admitted, his voice heavy with remorse. "I can't fix the past. But I want to be here for the future. Whatever it takes. However long it takes." Madison studied him for a long moment, searching for cracks in his resolve, for signs of the selfishness she remembered. But what she saw instead was sincerity, raw and unpolished, something she hadn't expected. She said nothing more, but her silence felt less like dismissal and more like a challenge. "Prove it." As the morning ended and they prepared to leave, Sophie surprised him again. She slipped her small hand into his, holding it for only a few seconds before pulling away and running back to her mother. It was fleeting, fragile, but for Andrew, it was everything. It was the beginning of something he had never imagined he would be allowed to have, and as he watched them walk away, he vowed silently that he would not waste this chance. That night, back in his apartment, the city lights glittered beyond the glass, but for once he didn't notice. All he could think about was the feel of that small hand in his, the spark of trust that had flickered in Sophie's eyes, and the faint softening in Madison's. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he was ready to walk it. For the first time in his life, Andrew Reeves, the man who thought he had everything, realized he was only just beginning to understand what truly mattered. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Andrew had ever experienced in his carefully curated life of control, wealth, and distance. He found himself adjusting his schedule in ways that would have horrified his younger self. Meetings that once took priority were rescheduled or shortened so he could spend afternoons at the park, or evenings sitting at Madison's kitchen table while Sophie chattered away about her day. At first, Madison insisted on being present for every interaction, her protective instincts refusing to yield. She sat close by, arms folded, her eyes never leaving them, as though waiting for him to slip back into the cold, dismissive man she remembered. But slowly, as the days stretched into weeks, her vigilance began to ease. She watched him crouch to help Sophie build block towers, watched him laugh when she painted his hands with washable markers, watched him patiently endure her endless questions about why the sky was blue or why rabbits had long ears. And though she tried to hide it, a flicker of doubt started to gnaw at her conviction that he would fail them again. For Andrew, every moment with Sophie was both a gift and a punishment. Her innocence, her laughter, the way she clung to her stuffed rabbit all reminded him of the years he had missed. He found himself grieving for the first words he had never heard, for the tiny hand he had never held as she took her first steps, for the countless bedtimes he had missed. He carried that grief like a weight, but rather than dragging him down, it drove him forward. He was determined not to lose another second. The board members of his company were baffled by the transformation. The ruthless CEO they had known was distracted, softer, even human in ways they had never imagined. Andrew barely noticed their shock. His focus had shifted so completely that the company's endless pursuit of profit seemed small compared to the glow in his daughter's eyes when she showed him a drawing she made at preschool. One evening, Madison invited him into her apartment rather than meeting at the park or a cafe. It was a modest place, filled with warmth that came not from expensive decor but from the evidence of a life carefully built. Children's books lined a low shelf in the living room, Sophie's drawings taped haphazardly to the refrigerator, small shoes by the door. Andrew stood awkwardly in the entryway, realizing he had never been in a home that felt so alive. When Sophie bounded forward, tugging him inside to see her room, he followed, humbled by her enthusiasm. Her room was small, with a bed covered in a quilt stitched by Madison's mother, shelves crowded with dolls and stuffed animals, and glow-in-the-dark stars scattered across the ceiling. Sophie climbed onto the bed and pulled out a book, insisting that Andrew read it to her. His voice was unsteady at first, unused to the rhythm of children's stories, but Sophie didn't seem to notice. She leaned against him, her small body warm and trusting, and as he read about talking animals and magical forests, he felt something shift inside him. It was not the calculated satisfaction of a business victory but something deeper, quieter, more profound. Later, when Sophie had fallen asleep, Madison stood in the doorway, watching. For a moment, she seemed ready to speak, but she stopped herself. When Andrew carefully tucked Sophie under her blanket and kissed her forehead, Madison finally broke the silence. "She's never let anyone but me put her to bed before," she said softly, her voice laced with a mixture of surprise and something almost like hope. Andrew swallowed hard, feeling the magnitude of what she had given him, even if unintentionally. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would convince her that he was not the same man she remembered, but words failed him. Instead, he nodded, his eyes lingering on the sleeping child who had already rewritten his world. Over time, the fragile truce between him and Madison began to evolve into something more complex. Their conversations shifted from guarded exchanges about Sophie's needs to hesitant glimpses into the past they had shared and the mistakes that had destroyed them. Madison admitted how alone she had felt after he walked away, how she had built her strength from the ashes of betrayal, how every day had been a battle to prove that she and her daughter could thrive without him. Andrew listened without interruption, each word cutting deep, but he refused to run from the pain this time. He needed to hear it, to carry it, to ensure he never repeated it. He began to share his own truths too, confessing the fear that had driven him to deny her years ago, the arrogance that had convinced him freedom was more valuable than family, and the emptiness that had haunted him even before he knew about Sophie. It was not easy. Old wounds bled into new ones, and there were nights Madison nearly told him to leave, nights when his presence stirred up more pain than comfort. But there were also moments when she glimpsed the man he was becoming, moments when Sophie's laughter seemed to weave them together into something that almost resembled a family. Andrew found himself yearning not only for his daughter's love but also for Madison's forgiveness, though he knew he had no right to expect it. One night, after Sophie had gone to sleep, Madison poured herself a glass of wine and sat across from him at the kitchen table. She studied him for a long time before finally speaking. "You're different," she admitted, her voice cautious. "But I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Not with me. Not with her." Andrew leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You don't have to trust me now. Just watch me. Watch what I do for her. For both of you. If I fail, then you'll know I never deserved this second chance. But if I don't, maybe, one day, you'll believe me." Madison held his gaze, her blue eyes searching his, and though she said nothing, her silence felt like the beginning of something fragile but real. That night, when he finally left her apartment and walked into the cool night air, Andrew realized that his life had narrowed down to something beautifully simple. The empire he had built, the fortune he had amassed, the power he had wielded, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was a little girl who believed in pancakes and bedtime stories, and a woman who still carried the scars he had given her. He didn't know if he could heal them, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to try with everything he had. The weeks had turned into months, and though Andrew's presence in Sophie's life had become more consistent, there was still a wall between him and Madison that seemed impossible to scale. She tolerated him, she even allowed him into her home, but she never fully relaxed when he was near. Her trust was a fragile thing, and Andrew felt the weight of it every time she watched him interact with their daughter. He could see her unspoken fears, the doubts etched in her expression when she thought he wasn't looking, and he knew that one misstep could shatter everything he was trying to rebuild. That fear haunted him, but it also pushed him to be more patient than he had ever been in his life. His board members had long since stopped questioning why their ruthless CEO was canceling late-night strategy sessions or refusing to fly overseas for certain deals. They whispered behind his back, but Andrew didn't care. All that mattered was being there for Sophie. One Saturday afternoon, Andrew showed up with tickets to the aquarium. Sophie squealed with excitement, jumping into his arms, and even Madison's stern expression softened slightly as she grabbed her coat and followed them. Inside the massive glass tunnels, Sophie pressed her hands against the walls, her wide blue eyes reflecting the shimmer of passing fish. Andrew walked behind her, watching the wonder on her face, and he felt Madison's gaze on him. When Sophie called for him to look at the jellyfish, he crouched down beside her and let her guide his hand to the glass, her tiny fingers gripping his with absolute trust. It was in that moment that Andrew caught Madison's reflection in the glass and saw something he hadn't expected. Her eyes weren't guarded anymore. They were sad, almost wistful, as if she was remembering a time when things between them had been simple and full of possibility. Later, they sat at a small cafe near the aquarium, Sophie munching on a cookie while swinging her legs under the table. Andrew excused himself to grab napkins, and when he returned, he found Madison staring at him with an unreadable expression. She spoke quietly, so Sophie wouldn't hear. "She loves you. She doesn't even question it. But I still don't know if I should let you stay." Her words stung, but Andrew didn't flinch. He sat down slowly, meeting her eyes. "I know I don't deserve her unconditional love, and I don't deserve your forgiveness yet. But I'm not going anywhere. Not again. You can push me out 100 times, and I'll still come back, because I've already lost too much." Madison didn't respond immediately, but she didn't look away either, and in that silence something began to shift between them, subtle but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, Sophie became the bridge neither of them could have built alone. She insisted on family dinners, demanded they both attend her preschool recital, and one night, when Andrew was about to leave, she clung to his arm and begged him to stay for bedtime. Madison hesitated, clearly torn, but Sophie's pleading was impossible to resist. Andrew stayed, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Sophie's room as she performed an elaborate routine with her dolls. When she finally crawled under her blanket, she looked at both of them and whispered, "Can you stay together forever? Please?" The question froze the air in the room. Madison blinked rapidly, her throat tightening, and Andrew's chest constricted with a mix of hope and shame. He leaned forward and brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's forehead. "We'll both always be here for you," he said softly, though he knew the words weren't enough to answer her plea. After Sophie fell asleep, Andrew lingered by the door as Madison tucked the blanket tighter around her daughter. When they stepped into the hallway, Madison exhaled sharply, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much she wants this. And how much it terrifies me. If you leave again, Andrew, it will destroy her." Her words carried the weight of everything she had endured, and Andrew could feel her fear pressing down on him. He nodded slowly. "Then I won't leave. I don't care what it takes, Madison. I'm going to prove to both of you that I'm not that man anymore." She studied him in silence, searching his face for the lies she had once believed too easily, and for the first time she found none. The breaking point came one rainy evening when Madison's car broke down on her way home from work. She was stranded with Sophie, standing in the downpour, her phone nearly dead. Andrew was the first person she thought to call, though she hesitated for several minutes before dialing his number. He arrived faster than she expected, stepping out of his sleek car without an umbrella, the rain soaking his suit. He didn't complain, didn't hesitate, he simply scooped Sophie into his arms and walked them both to his car. Madison watched him buckle Sophie into the back seat, his movements careful and instinctive, and something inside her cracked open. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life could have been like if he had chosen differently years ago, if he had been this man all along. When he dropped them off at her apartment, Andrew lingered at the door. Madison surprised herself when she asked softly, "Do you want to come in?" He hesitated, then followed her inside. That night, they sat on the couch long after Sophie was asleep, sipping tea and talking not about the past but about the present, about Sophie's favorite songs, about Madison's work, about the little details that had been missing from their lives together. For the first time, Madison laughed at something he said, a genuine laugh that made his chest ache with longing. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack of light through the heavy door she had kept closed for so long. By the time he left that night, Madison found herself standing at the window, watching his car disappear into the rain. She pressed her hand against the glass and realized with a mix of fear and exhilaration that she wanted him to come back, not just for Sophie but for herself. And though she didn't say it aloud, Andrew felt it too, that the tide was finally turning, that maybe, just maybe, they were finding their way back to each other. The days following that night were filled with a strange electricity neither Madison nor Andrew could ignore. There was no spoken agreement, no declaration of reconciliation, but an unspoken shift had taken place. Andrew began to spend more time with Sophie, but also with Madison, not because she invited him directly but because the boundaries she once held so firmly were beginning to soften. He found himself in her kitchen more often, cooking breakfast with Sophie while Madison sat at the table watching them with an expression she tried to mask. He helped Sophie with her drawings, with her numbers, with her small, curious questions about the world, but he also started helping Madison with the practical burdens she had carried alone for so long, fixing a leaky faucet, replacing a broken lamp, or simply being there when the weight of raising a child alone showed in the tired lines of her face. Yet with every step forward, the shadow of the past lingered. One Friday evening, Andrew arrived unexpectedly at Sophie's preschool recital, walking into the crowded hall just moments before it began. Madison stiffened when she saw him but didn't send him away. When Sophie spotted him in the audience, her face lit up so brightly it brought tears to Andrew's eyes. She waved with both hands, almost losing her balance on stage, and Madison glanced at him with a mixture of frustration and something she could not hide, gratitude. After the recital, Sophie ran into his arms, and he held her tightly, realizing that moments like these were the foundation he had been missing his whole life. But not everyone was ready to forgive him so easily. Madison's sister Claire, who had helped her through the darkest years, confronted him after the recital. Pulling him aside, her voice sharp with anger, she said, "You don't get to waltz back in and play the hero after what you did to her. Do you even know how hard it was for her? How many nights she cried because of you? Don't think for one second that showing up now erases the years you abandoned them." Andrew stood there, taking the blows without protest. He didn't argue or defend himself, because deep down he knew she was right. All he said, quietly, was, "I know. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to be better now." Claire shook her head in disbelief, but she noticed the sincerity in his eyes before she walked away. That night, as he drove home, Andrew replayed Claire's words over and over, and for the first time, he allowed himself to confront the full extent of his past cowardice. He realized he couldn't simply rely on time and persistence to rebuild what he had destroyed. He had to face the ugliness of his choices, not only for Madison but for himself. The next morning, he called his assistant and canceled an important business trip he had been scheduled to take. Instead of flying to London to secure a multi-million-dollar contract, he showed up at Madison's door with coffee and muffins, unshaven and tired but determined. Madison raised an eyebrow in surprise, and when she asked why he wasn't on a plane, he replied simply, "Because Sophie deserves me here more than the company deserves me there." Over the weeks that followed, Madison found herself caught between her heart and her fears. She couldn't deny the changes in him, his gentleness with Sophie, his patience with her, his willingness to accept responsibility without excuses. But the memories of the past still haunted her. One night, when Sophie had a fever and Madison panicked, Andrew came rushing over with medicine and stayed by her side until dawn, wiping Sophie's forehead and carrying her when she was too weak to stand. Madison watched him rock their daughter to sleep, humming softly, and felt something inside her collapse. She whispered into the silence, "Where was this man when I needed him most?" Andrew didn't look up, but his voice broke as he answered, buried under fear and pride. "And it cost me everything." It was a turning point, one that neither of them acknowledged directly but both felt deeply. Madison realized that the man before her was no longer the same one who had walked away years ago. Andrew, on the other hand, understood that his redemption would never be about grand gestures or apologies alone. It would be built slowly, brick by brick, through the countless small moments of showing up, of choosing them over himself every single time. And so, their fragile connection grew stronger. Madison began to let him in more, though always cautiously. They shared dinners together, not as a family in the full sense but as something close, something that hinted at the possibility of healing. Sophie, blissfully unaware of the storm beneath the surface, thrived in the warmth of having them both. Her laughter filled the spaces that had once been heavy with silence, and even Madison found herself smiling more often. But deep down, she still carried one final fear, that this fragile happiness could shatter the moment Andrew decided the burden was too heavy. And Andrew, sensing that fear, vowed silently that he would never allow it to happen. Not again. He was no longer the man who had walked away, and he would spend the rest of his life proving it, not with words but with unwavering presence. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything shifted in a way that neither Madison nor Andrew could have predicted. Sophie had been invited to a birthday party at a friend's house, and for the first time, Madison suggested that Andrew take her alone. It was a small step, but for Andrew, it felt monumental. He dressed Sophie in her favorite blue dress, braided her hair clumsily but with determination, and held her hand as they walked into the party together. He was nervous at first, unsure of how other parents might perceive him, but Sophie's unshakable joy gave him courage. She introduced him proudly to her friends as "my daddy," and every time she said the word, Andrew felt a rush of both pride and guilt. Pride because she accepted him so completely, guilt because it had taken him 5 years to earn such a simple title. While the children played in the backyard, Andrew lingered with the other parents, answering polite questions about work and life. He realized quickly that the world of parents was different from the world he had built in boardrooms and luxury offices. Here, no one cared about his wealth or his empire, they only cared that their children were happy and safe. Andrew found it oddly humbling, almost refreshing, to be judged not by his net worth but by the tenderness in his voice when Sophie ran to him for a hug. The party should have been uneventful, but halfway through, chaos erupted. Sophie, chasing after a ball, tripped over a tree root and hit her head on the edge of the wooden deck. For a split second, there was silence, then the sharp sound of her crying pierced the air. Andrew's heart stopped. He was at her side in an instant, scooping her into his arms, his mind racing. A small cut above her eyebrow bled more than it should have, and though it wasn't deep, the sight of her blood sent panic surging through him. Parents rushed forward offering help, but Andrew barely heard them. He carried Sophie to his car, whispering frantically that she would be okay, that Daddy was here. At the hospital, Madison arrived minutes after Andrew, her face pale and her hands trembling as she rushed into the emergency room. Seeing Sophie with a bandage on her forehead, sitting quietly in Andrew's lap, brought tears to her eyes. She turned on Andrew, her voice sharp with fear. "How could you let this happen? You were supposed to protect her." Andrew didn't defend himself, didn't remind her that accidents happen. He simply nodded, holding Sophie tighter, his own guilt already suffocating him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have been more careful." Madison's anger melted into exhaustion as she saw the torment in his expression. She sank into a chair beside him, her shoulders slumping, her eyes never leaving Sophie's face. For hours, they sat together in the sterile hospital room, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them after being treated. It was in that quiet, with the hum of machines in the background, that Madison realized something she hadn't allowed herself to before. Andrew wasn't the careless, selfish man she had once known. He wasn't trying to run or deflect blame. He was here, fully present, willing to carry the weight of her fears alongside his own. Later that night, when they returned to Madison's apartment, Andrew carried Sophie upstairs and laid her gently in bed. He stayed by her side long after Madison had stepped into the hallway, his hand resting on her small one, his eyes fixed on her sleeping face. When he finally emerged, Madison was waiting for him. Her expression was still guarded, but softer than he had ever seen it. "You didn't leave," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You stayed through all of it." Andrew looked at her, his voice steady though his heart pounded in his chest. "I'm never leaving again. Not when things are easy, and not when they're hard. I'll be here for every scraped knee, every fever, every tear. I don't care how much it hurts me to see her hurt, I'd rather feel that pain than the emptiness of not knowing her." Madison searched his face for any trace of dishonesty, but she found none. For the first time in years, she believed him, not because of the words he spoke, but because of the way he had cradled their daughter in a hospital waiting room, the way he had blamed himself when no one else did, the way he had stayed without hesitation. She realized that the man before her was not the same man who had once walked away. That night, as Andrew left her apartment, Madison watched him go with a strange mix of emotions. Fear still lingered, but so did hope, and for the first time those two feelings didn't feel like enemies. She closed the door softly and leaned against it, her heart pounding as she whispered to herself, "Maybe he really has changed." Weeks after Sophie's accident, the bond that had slowly been forming between Andrew, Madison, and their daughter grew into something far more tangible. The distance that once defined them had started to fade, though traces of hesitation remained. Madison was cautious by nature, her heart still guarded after years of raising Sophie on her own, and Andrew was determined to show through action that this time he was not going to falter. He knew that words could be empty, and he had spoken too many empty words before, so now he measured his love by what he did. He showed up for Sophie's preschool mornings, reading with her before class, and he stayed through late evenings, helping Madison fold laundry or cook meals. Slowly, they began to look like something resembling a family, though neither dared to name it aloud. The true test of Andrew's transformation came one unexpected evening when a storm swept through the city. Madison had gone to pick Sophie up from a playdate while Andrew wrapped up a meeting downtown. The rain was relentless, and traffic snarled the streets. Madison's car stalled halfway home, forcing her and Sophie to wait at the side of the road. Sophie clung to her mother, frightened by the lightning flashing across the sky. Madison tried to stay calm, but panic gnawed at her. She was stranded, her phone battery nearly gone, and her daughter growing more terrified with each thunderclap. With only a few % left, she called Andrew, her voice trembling as she told him where she was. Andrew didn't hesitate. He left the meeting without a second thought, ignoring the protests of his colleagues, and sped through the storm. When he arrived, his suit was soaked within seconds, but he didn't care. He ran to the car, pulled Sophie into his arms, and covered Madison with his jacket as he guided them both to his vehicle. Inside, as Sophie buried her face in his chest, Andrew whispered reassurances that she was safe now, that he would always come when they needed him. Madison sat in the passenger seat, watching him with tears in her eyes, realizing that this was the man she had begged him to be years ago. Back at Madison's apartment, after Sophie was tucked into bed, the storm still raging outside, Andrew lingered in the living room. Madison brought him a towel and a change of clothes he had left there weeks before. As he dried his hair, she sat across from him, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I used to think you only cared about yourself," she admitted softly. "But tonight, you dropped everything. You came straight to us." Andrew looked at her, his expression raw and unguarded. "You and Sophie are everything. I didn't understand that before, and I wasted years convincing myself freedom was worth more than family. But I've never been more wrong in my life. I don't want freedom anymore, Madison. I want you. I want her. I want the life I should have fought for from the beginning." His voice cracked, the weight of his regret heavy in the air, but his eyes never left hers. Madison swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. She had dreamed of these words once, and they had always come too late. But now, seeing him soaked from the storm, remembering the way he had carried Sophie with such care, she realized it wasn't words that moved her, it was everything he had done to prove them true. Slowly, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't know if I can forget the past," she said honestly, her voice trembling. "But I think I can finally believe in our future." For the first time in years, Andrew felt a rush of relief so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He leaned forward, pressing her hand to his lips, and whispered, "Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret giving me this chance." From that night forward, things were different. They weren't perfect, old wounds don't heal overnight, but there was a unity between them that had never existed before. Andrew moved carefully, never pushing, never demanding, but showing up every single day. Madison allowed herself to lean on him in small ways, letting him take Sophie to school, letting him handle the little burdens she had carried alone for too long. Sophie, blissfully unaware of the complicated history between her parents, thrived in the new sense of security and love that surrounded her. Months later, as they stood together at Sophie's kindergarten graduation, Andrew looked down the row at Madison and his daughter and realized that his life, once defined by power and wealth, had been redefined entirely by love. When Sophie ran into his arms at the end of the ceremony, her little cap askew, he lifted her high into the air, his heart so full it ached. Madison stood nearby, watching with a smile that no longer held hesitation, only hope. Andrew knew then that his redemption wasn't about erasing the past but about building a new life from the ashes of it. And as he stood with Madison and Sophie, hand in hand, he understood that he had finally found the one thing that had always been missing, the family he had once been too blind to see.